Good evening. There are 3,340 known drug addicts in Britain. But unlike the 500,000 addicts in this country, their habit is legally maintained, some of them on pure heroin, through a government-controlled program that treats heroin addiction as an illness, not as a criminal problem. In recent months, pressure has been building in this country to try heroin maintenance, at least experimentally. Tonight we examine the arguments for and against such an approach. Would it actually reduce the enormous amount of crime associated with addiction? Would this step towards legalizing heroin create more addicts? But first, let's look at the British experience. Since 1924, Britain has treated drug addiction as a medical problem, largely administered by family doctors. Then, in 1967, the government put the supply of narcotics for addicts into the hands of 30 hospital clinics. Although the treatment and drugs are free, access is not easy. An addict has to first prove his or her addiction to the psychiatrists who run the clinics. Each clinic has its own policy, but the current thinking is to put all new patients on synthetic drugs, like oral methadone. Dr. John Reed, a consultant psychiatrist in charge of the Hackney Hospital Drug Clinic in suburban London, explains the restrictions.
The addict themselves never handles the prescription. This is sent by post to the pharmacist of their choice, usually near where they're living or where they're working. And we send out a prescription to cover a week's supply of narcotics. And then it's up to the addict themselves to go to the pharmacy each day and collect their supply day by day.
But are the addicts seeking help or just a free fix?
And the clinic has got you off morphine. What are you on now?
40 milligrams of Ficeptone.
Does that satisfy your need?
To a certain extent, it does stop most compulsion to sort of score on the black market. I wouldn't really put myself out unless the opportunity sort of presented itself, you know.
Should a British addict really want to look for the opportunity, he can do it in Piccadilly, the center of London's tourist traffic, and of much of the illegal drug trade, used by an estimated 10,000 people. Above ground, there's an all-night pharmacy, and below a maze of subway tunnels, with toilets that provide privacy and running water for the junkies. And for many, the problem remains underground, until they read of the 5 addicts found dead here in January, or of a rock star arrested for possession. The official British system costs about $2.5 million, 1/5 of it spent on narcotics. Some would like the program cut down, but there are dangers. Right now, there is little evidence in Britain of crimes committed to pay for drugs. But even with a free drug program, some people still use the black market. Why?
You don't get the same methadone that you do off of heroin, but it seems to almost get there, but not quite.
Other illegal drug purchasers include first-time users, not yet introduced to the bureaucratic drug scene, and those who just prefer private enterprise. Only yards from Piccadilly is London's Chinatown, the source of illicit Chinese heroin. The trade is thought to be controlled by a secret Chinese society, the Triads. In the last 6 months, 2 big cases against gang members have shown that there are rich pickings, even in Britain where addicts can get a free supply through the state. Another small but sad source of illegal drugs comes from leaks within the government-controlled system, or dissatisfied patients who prefer to sell some of their prescription in exchange for adulterated Chinese heroin.
Some clinics, you can go along, blag your doctor and get twice as much as what you need, and that is sold. People who get far bigger scripts than they need, they then sell them.
I think that's probably true. I One's got no proof of it, but one does hear that rumour very often, yes. I think if it's true, it's obviously very regrettable.
Even though government officials do not consider drug addiction a major problem in Britain, the present system does not satisfy everyone. There's presently an inquiry into the program and concern that the real dimensions of the problem aren't known. Some critics say the policy of putting new patients on synthetic drugs, such as methadone, is forcing people back to the black market. It would be better, they say, to allow new patients to remain on heroin, as long-time patients are. If this doesn't happen, they warn, it could mean a proliferation of illegal drugs and open the door to the large drug syndicates. One critic of the system is London Times reporter Stuart Tendler.
I think our system tends to work as a means of control. In the 60s, when this system was originated, it was seen as a method of controlling a disease. Addiction was seen as a form of disease. The problem is that in the intervening time, the disease has become controlled, but not really the patients. We have very few patients cured.
I think one very good measure of our success over the years has been the fact that for quite a long time now, having started with a quite unstable population, we're now in the situation where year in, year out, somewhere between 60 and 70% of the people who attend here getting regular narcotic prescriptions are also regularly working and supporting themselves, often in very well-paid jobs indeed.
The British system is one form of heroin maintenance, that is, sustaining drug addicts on legally administered pure heroin instead of or with substitute drugs like methadone. It was legal in this country earlier in this century. Now it's being proposed again. If such a program were adopted here, it would fall under the jurisdiction of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Dr. Robert DuPont, a psychiatrist with many years in the drug field, is director of that agency. Dr. DuPont, first of all, what's your evaluation of the British system?
Well, I think it's basically worked quite well for the British. It's a little unfortunate to pass judgment now because all of Europe is undergoing a major heroin epidemic, and countries as different as Italy and Germany and England are all seeing a rise. So to attribute this rise to the British use of heroin in their clinics, I think is unfortunate. But it is a fact that the problem is worsening in Britain right now.
Based on the British experience when it worked as far as it did, are you in favor of trying a heroin maintenance program in this country?
I think the biggest problem is that people tend to get polarized on this issue and view it as either an unmitigated disaster that would undo the substantial progress that's been made in the drug area in the last decade in this country, or to see it as a solution to the problem. And I think neither of those would happen. And I think your film summary gave a pretty good picture of that. That it's certainly not a panacea as it's often portrayed, and neither has it really been a disaster, at least as it's shown in Britain. I think a well thought out experimental program in the United States might be reasonable. The biggest problem we have here is the problem of take-home heroin, and as you accurately portrayed, there's a tremendous temptation for the heroin to be sold on the street. Here, for example, an average 100 milligrams of heroin would be worth $150 every day to the person walking out of the clinic, and I think that's a kind of temptation that just couldn't be afforded here.
I see. But are you in favor yourself of an experimental program in heroin maintenance?
Well, I'd like to see a specific proposal before I commit myself on that, but I wouldn't write it off out of hand.
Do you think that it could reduce the crime associated with heroin addiction in this country?
It might. I think, though, that we have to realize that there are methadone clinics in the United States that provide maintenance to deal with the habit, as well as large numbers of drug-free programs. The majority of people in treatment, in drug abuse treatment in the United States, don't use methadone either. And probably the most striking criticism of the British system is that they don't have any drug-free treatment. All they have is maintenance, and here we offer some alternatives. I don't think, though, that using heroin in clinics here is going to have a startling effect on our crime rate.
So you're not terribly impressed with the idea of heroin maintenance programs, but you might like to see a firm proposal for one to be tried experimentally. Is that your position?
That's an excellent summary of my position.
All right. Thank you very much. One of the groups that has recently called for the establishment of a pilot program of heroin maintenance is the National League of Cities. Richard Hatcher, mayor of Gary, Indiana, was the chairman of the Human Resources Committee which drafted the proposal last December. Mayor Hatcher is with us tonight in the studios of WGN-TV in Chicago. Mayor Hatcher, what was the rationale behind the recommendation of the National League?
Well, I think essentially it's important to understand that the recommendation did not call for a heroin maintenance system in the United States. It did call, however, for carefully controlled experiments, small experiments around the country to acquire information and determine whether or not such a system might be feasible. So the rationale basically was to acquire more information than we presently have.
But you did call for a sort of pilot program or a series of small pilot programs.
Yes, we did. I might point out that the National League of Cities is basically a conservative organization, and when we first took up this matter approximately a year or so ago, there was almost unanimous opposition to the idea even of heroin maintenance experiments. Over the period of a year, we researched the question, the Human Resources Committee researched the question. We had a number of experts appear before that committee to discuss it, and at the end of that time, the committee itself was almost unanimously in favor of heroin maintenance experiments, and that proved to be the case with the entire body at our meeting in Denver in December. But I do want to point out that it was a matter, first of all, of last resort. The feeling was that heroin maintenance should be attempted only as a matter of last resort, and that we ought to try all the other modalities before going to that. And secondly, that we are calling for, at this time, small, very carefully controlled experiments.
I see. Is it your feeling, your own personal feeling, that this could be a way to reduce some of the crime that afflicts cities like yours where there is a drug problem?
Well, I think that the experiments themselves will be very difficult because if you have one area, for example, one neighborhood where heroin might be available to the addict from a clinic, and in other parts of the city the heroin is not available on that basis, then I think you have a serious problem, as I think Dr. DuPont alluded to. But I do feel that if it were possible to take the profit out of the sale of heroin in this country, there is no question that there is a system of heroin distribution that exists in this country, operated primarily by the underworld, and that anyone who has the price can, in fact, purchase the heroin for use. So if it were possible to take the profit out of that business, as it were, then at least I think we would see some mitigation of the crime, the byproduct of crime that we are presently experiencing in most cities in this country. Now, to what degree, to what extent crime would be reduced, I'm not in a position to say, although there has been some efforts to determine that. I think there was a Detroit study that did suggest that there was a direct connection between the availability of heroin on the street and the incidence of certain types of crimes. And I think the National League of Cities would like to gain more information in order to make a judgment in that respect.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Mayor. We'll come back. But what about the communities these clinics would be placed in if they were established? Do the people in the inner cities of this nation really want this approach? One man with some experience in this is Amos Hennicks, program director of the Manhood Foundation in New York. Mr. Hennicks is a former addict himself and the founder of Reality House, the first drug-free treatment center for addicts in New York City. Mr. Hennicks, what's your reaction to the idea of heroin maintenance programs?
Well, I'm against any type of maintenance.
You're against maintenance with methadone or any other substitute or heroin itself?
Right, because I think what's not being said is who's going to make the money, the government or the mafia? If we really take into consideration all of the programs that have been tried, that have failed, the only one that hasn't had a decent exposure is the private sector, drug-free clinics. Everyone feels that they have some ideas about what should be done about drug addiction when they don't have the experience, when they don't live under the adverse conditions that the majority of the drug addicts live under. And when we make a comparison between the English experience and the American experience, there's no similarities that can be made. We're talking about two different countries.
And the cultural difference is so good that it's so great that it overrides any similarities based on heroin addiction, you think?
Yes, of course. You don't even have to go to England. Just go to Brooklyn. You go around the corner, you're in another cultural situation. Programs has to be designed in order to fulfill the needs of the people that's involved.
I see. Are you convinced yourself that using heroin legally administered might not remove some of it from the street market and therefore help to reduce the crime that's associated with it?
I have no reason to believe otherwise. They've tried several types of programs. Methadone is a big flop. It's a big failure, even though the system is still trying to find some way to justify methadone maintenance. Now they're going to bring heroin in. If it's not codeine, it's another. They're looking for the magic pill. There is no magic. There's no way to deal with that other than to get people to accept certain responsibilities and include these people in the realities that they're a part of. Give them some say. Let them determine what they need. I'm not against doctors. They're all right. They have their place. But we cannot continuously look at doctors if they're superhumans.
I see. You live in Harlem and you work in Harlem. What would be the reaction of the community there if somebody did set up a clinic or a center where there was heroin administered legally?
It would be completely negative if I can believe what my colleagues and other people that I see every day say, that they're not above blowing one of those institutions up if they establish it in Harlem. We've had enough. You see, the black community has had enough of experimentation in every aspect of existence, especially in the drug area. Like the idea that the black is the original drug addict is not the case at all. We do not grow heroin in Harlem. We do not grow poppy in Harlem. We do not grow any drugs in Harlem. These drugs are brought to Harlem.
I see. Would you tell us, just briefly, how you ended your own addiction, how you overcame that?
By being in a situation where I could begin to understand that the responsibility for my life was my own, to be able to look within myself and have the freedom to do so. If someone told me at my weakest point that the thing for you to do, Amos, is to get high and stay high, right now you would be talking to an addict. I've been free of drugs at least 18 years. So I can't agree with that type of mentality that says, well, let's give them what they want, even if it kills them.
In other words, if there had been a maintenance program in your day, either heroin or methadone or anything, to keep you high, you'd still be an addict today.
I'm almost certain of it.
I see. Mayor Hatcher, how do you react to Mr. Hennick's comments?
Well, I think, first of all, Mr. Hennick is certainly in a much better position to know than I am, and he certainly knows about Harlem far better than I do. But I did find one very interesting point. When the National League of Cities adopted the policy on heroin maintenance, I received probably a greater reaction from that from around the country in the form of letters than any other issue in the 8 or 9 years that I've been mayor. And the interesting thing to me was that a large number of those letters came from addicts themselves. And I would say 98, 99% of those letters said this would be a good idea. This is something that should have been done long ago. I talked to addicts in my own city, in Gary, about this program. I found none of them who were negative towards the idea. Most of them were very positive towards the idea and felt that this might very well be the answer or the solution. Now, I do want to say, and I agree with Mr. Hennick, that if the program is simply to provide heroin to an addict, then I don't think that solves many problems. Maybe it might reduce the crime that's associated with it, but beyond that, I don't think it does anything for the addict. But I would see such a program being coupled with, first of all, of course, education, being coupled with treatment, other kinds of treatment, the idea of moving an addict from heroin as quickly as possible to some other drug and perhaps into a completely drug-free situation.
You're talking about something like what's called an induction program, I think, where you attract the addict into it by promising heroin, then after a year or so you take him off that and move him on to other things.
Assuming he's able to do that. And I might point, in our own city, we have two programs. We have a methadone treatment program, thanks to Dr. DuPont, and we also have a program that attempts to provide a drug-free situation for addicts. And I must say that right now the methadone program seems to be working well. And I say seems to be, I believe that it is working well. The other program, it had, I think, some success, but not a great deal. It was very difficult to create the kind of atmosphere that would permit an addict to remain drug-free for very long. And I'm not saying that's a failure. I think those programs ought to be continued. We ought to continue to try, but I'm not sure that they represent the total solution to the problem that we're confronted with either.
Mayor Hatcher, I'd like to get Dr. DuPont's reaction to Mr. Hennicks's objection to any kind of maintenance program as something that's just going to keep a person an addict.
Well, I think
What are the statistics on that, to your knowledge?
Well, the statistics are that both the drug-free programs and the maintenance programs have more successes than most of us have anticipated. We followed up a group of 1,000 people who were admitted to federally funded drug treatment programs because of heroin addiction in the 1969 to 1971 period, and there was about a 75% reduction in the use of heroin 4 years later, and that was about as good for the people who were on methadone as the people who were in drug-free treatment. So I think the image that once an addict, always an addict, although that does describe some people, is not the majority opinion, the majority experience. And I think it's very important that our society keep up the kind of pressure that Mr. Hennicks is talking about toward self-realization and not write off a class of people. Now, the image the public has often is that methadone maintenance is for a lifetime. And this is simply not the case. Most people who enter methadone programs are not happy with the programs, with all the restrictions on their movements, all the compulsory urine tests and everything else. And because of the widespread feeling in the community of opposition to any kind of maintenance, they are highly motivated to get off, and most of them do. Now, for some, there's a relapse and they'll come back onto methadone, or they'll next time go into a drug-free program. But I think the principle here that is terribly important is that in the last few years, after decades, literally, of ignoring the problem, the human problems of addiction, this country has made a substantial commitment of resources. 60% of our national resources in the drug abuse field are going into providing treatment experiences, both drug-free, detoxification, and maintenance experiences. And that kind of commitment, I think, is terribly important. We don't need a heroin lure to bring people into treatment. The fact is the treatment programs of this country are full, whether we're talking about Gary, Indiana, or Harlem, or Des Moines, Iowa. The fact is that drug treatment programs are full, and what we need to do is to provide more funds for drug treatment programs of all kinds in this country. We don't need to lure more people into treatment.
Mr. Hennicks, Dr. DuPont seems to think that maintenance programs are working, at least methadone maintenance programs.
Well, that has not been my experience. Some people could benefit from almost anything. But my experience has been that when a person is put on maintenance, especially methadone maintenance, in the community that I live and socialize in and work in, when I say Harlem, I'm not talking about a location necessarily in New York City. I'm talking about a Harlem anywhere that you find it in this country. One of the things that I'm saying is that when a person is on methadone, if he is inclined to steal, methadone will not stop him from stealing. The assumption there is that drugs is the problem. Drugs is not the problem. It's a symptom of a problem. If you're talking about guys on methadone, you're talking about a guy that goes in the clinic, sustains himself, and goes out and gets bombed on wine or whatever else is available. And the idea is beautiful, but in the practice, there's a lot to be desired. I haven't seen a program that can fulfill the needs, not everybody's needs.
Is your objection to this that when you hear about maintenance, and especially the new idea of heroin maintenance, that it may be directed more at trying to cut down on the crime than it is at treating the addict?
Listen, I'm convinced of it. First of all, the system is saying we don't know what to do with it. So let's just give them what they want. I haven't met an addict that wouldn't promise you anything. And if you put me on heroin, I'll really change.
Let me ask the mayor about that.
That's not true.
Let me ask the mayor about it. Mayor Hatcher, when you think of it, heroin maintenance or any of these programs, is the thing in your mind as the mayor of a city with a crime problem associated with drugs, look, the main thing is cutting down the crime. Is that the chief impetus behind this?
No, I really don't think so, not for myself at least, but I do think that it's important to keep in mind that right now the drug problem is a huge political problem in this country, and that as a matter of fact the problem of crime is a political problem. There is hardly a community in this country that you could not go to a city council and ask for a large appropriation for your police department to fight crime. You'll get it in a moment. You wouldn't have any problem getting it. But if you went to that same city council and asked for a program to provide drug education or drug treatment, then you'd have all kinds of problems. What I see heroin maintenance doing as one possibility, one thing it might do, is to take away some of the hysteria that surrounds the whole problem of crime associated with drugs and create an atmosphere within which we in fact can persuade the various governmental agencies, both local, state, and federal, to appropriate more funds for treatment and for perhaps doing some of the things that Mr. Hennick has in mind. But in the present atmosphere, I don't think that's very possible. I think when you talk to people about drugs today, the first thing they want to know is how can we hire more policemen? How can we have a tougher law or tougher law enforcement with regards to drugs? And I think
Mr. Mayor, excuse me, we have less than a minute. I just want to see what Dr. DuPont thinks about that. Do you think this could be politically the lever to, as the mayor puts it, reduce the hysteria surrounding this?
Well, I think we've made heroin a devil drug too long. I don't think heroin is that different from a lot of other drugs, so I think it would have that effect. Unfortunately, I think that the general public would be turned off even more by drug treatment than they are now, so I'm not sure it would be a net benefit. I'm afraid it might be a loser for us.
Well, I think we have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Dr. DuPont in Washington, Mayor Hatcher of Gary in Chicago this evening, and Mr. Hennick's here in New York with me. Jim Lehrer is on vacation this week. I'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
For a transcript, send $1 to the McNeil-Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10019. The McNeil-Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content. The program was made possible in part by grants from public television stations, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, Exxon Corporation, and the Ford Foundation.